Have you ever looked at a photograph of a life so perfect, it almost hurts? That was my life. The smiling couple, the beautiful home, the love story everyone envied. But what happens when you discover the man holding you in that picture isn't real? What do you do when you realize your perfect husband is a carefully constructed lie, and your entire world is the stage for his one-man show? This isn't a story about a marriage ending. It's the story of how I survived the man I loved and, in the wreckage he left behind, found the woman I was always meant to be. I was living the life you see on Pinterest boards, the pristine suburban home with the wraparound porch and the perfectly manicured lawn. The circle of admiring friends who always said, "You two are the definition of #couple goals." And at the very center of it all, there was him, my husband. Mr. Perfect. He was the kind of man who could walk into any room and command it with a disarming smile. He was charismatic, endlessly attentive, a pillar of our community who volunteered on weekends and knew the names of all our neighbors' kids. He was the kind of man who praised me in public, telling everyone how I was his rock, his everything. And in private, he seemed to read my soul, finishing my sentences, bringing me coffee just the way I liked it, without me ever having to ask. Our love felt like a fortress, impenetrable and safe. Or so I believed. I wasn't just his wife. I was the curator of our flawless life, the director behind the scenes, ensuring every piece was perfectly staged for the world's applause. And I played my part beautifully. But life isn't a photograph. It moves and breathes, and sometimes it cracks under pressure. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the cracks started to show in the perfect veneer of our marriage. They were small things you could almost dismiss as oversights or misunderstandings. A lie about where he'd been for dinner, smoothed over with a charming, "Oh, you know how my memory is, honey. I got the restaurants mixed up." A chilling emptiness in his eyes when he thought I wasn't looking. A fleeting moment where the mask slipped and there was just nothing behind it. A bank statement I found in the mail, showing a withdrawal from a city he was never supposed to be in. Every time I gathered the courage to question him, to point to the inconsistency, he was a master at flipping the script. He'd tilt his head with a look of deep concern, his voice soft and laced with feigned hurt. And suddenly, the conversation wasn't about his lie anymore. It was about my lack of trust. I was being too sensitive. I was overthinking things again. I was ungrateful for the beautiful life he provided. This is what they call gaslighting. It's a slow, insidious poison. He convinced me, with surgical precision, that I was the problem. And I, so desperate to keep the peace in our so-called paradise, desperate to believe in the fortress I thought we'd built, I believed him. I started to doubt my own mind, my own perceptions. The cracks were my fault, I thought. I just needed to be a better wife, a more trusting partner. The discovery wasn't a single, dramatic moment of revelation. It was a slow, agonizing unraveling. It was like pulling a loose thread on a cashmere sweater, and with every gentle tug, watching in horror as the whole thing came apart in your hands. The final thread, the one that unmade everything, was an email. I found it by accident. It was late one night, he was asleep upstairs, and I was on his laptop paying a bill. His email was already open. The subject line was a woman's name. My first thought, the gut-wrenching, cliché one, was that he was having an affair. I almost wished it was that simple. An affair is about a broken promise. This was about a shattered reality. It wasn't about a typical affair. It was something far more sinister. It was an entire correspondence that laid out, in black and white, the architecture of his deception. It was proof of a double life, of intricate financial manipulation, of assets and accounts I knew nothing about. But the worst part, the part that stopped my heart in my chest, was a conversation where he described me to this other person. He wrote about me with a cold, clinical disdain, as if I were an asset to be managed, a piece in his grand game. He called my love for him a useful tool. In that instant, reading those words on the glowing screen in the silent house, the truth hit me like a tidal wave. The man I loved didn't exist. He had never existed. He was a performance, a character he played to win admiration and to maintain control. And I was married to the empty space behind the mask. The pain of that discovery was visceral. It wasn't just a broken heart. It was the implosion of my entire reality, the ground turning to dust beneath my feet. Every memory we had ever made was now tainted, a scene from a movie where I was the only one who didn't know the script. Who was I, if the woman he claimed to love was just a part he'd cast in his play? For days, fear paralyzed me. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Leaving meant admitting to the world, and more terrifyingly, to myself, that my life, my beautiful, perfect life, had been a fraud. It meant facing the chorus of, "I told you so's." Or, even worse, the looks of pity. It meant facing the crushing loneliness of starting over from nothing. And above all, it meant facing his rage. Not the anger of a heartbroken husband, but the cold, manipulative rage of a puppeteer whose favorite puppet has just cut its own strings. He wouldn't be sad, he would be furious that he had lost control. For weeks, I lived in a terrified silence. I became an actress in my own home, which now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. I smiled when he kissed me goodbye in the morning, my stomach twisting into knots. I asked about his day, my mind replaying the words from his email. I walked on eggshells, studying the man I had slept next to for years, no longer seeing my husband, but a dangerous stranger whose next move I couldn't predict. Courage didn't come like a lightning bolt in a storm. It arrived as a quiet, persistent whisper from a part of myself I'd almost forgotten, a deep, primal survival instinct that refused to be silenced any longer. It whispered to me in the shower, while I was driving, while I was pretending to read a book. And one night, it finally screamed. I was standing in the bathroom, looking in the mirror at the exhausted, hollowed-out woman staring back at me. I didn't recognize her. Her eyes were filled with a fear I'd never seen before. And in that moment, the decision finally set, not in my mind, but in my bones. I would not let my soul die to keep his lie alive. Leaving was the most terrifying and bravest thing I have ever done. There was no dramatic showdown, no tear-filled confrontation. I knew that would be a stage for him to perform on. Another chance for him to manipulate and control the narrative. This had to be a quiet, strategic operation to untangle myself from his web. I waited. A week later, he left for one of his business trips. The moment his car pulled out of the driveway, I started moving. I didn't take furniture, or art, or any of the things that had decorated our lie. I packed what was left of my identity into 2 suitcases. Old journals, a handful of books I loved, the worn-out sweater that always felt like home, and a few photographs of the people who had loved me before he came along. I walked into our bedroom, the room where I had been so happy and so miserable, and I took off my wedding ring. I placed it on the nightstand, right where he would see it when he got back. And then I walked out the door, and for the first time, I didn't look back. Every step away from that house was a step into a terrifying, gaping, unknown. The future was a blank page. But for the first time in years, I was the one holding the pen. I was in control of my own freefall. At first, freedom tasted a lot like grief. It was a bitter, confusing flavor. I wasn't just mourning the end of the marriage. I was mourning the life I thought I had, the man who never truly was, and the naive, trusting woman I had been. She was gone forever. The first few months were a blur of sterile divorce lawyers, offices, gut-wrenching therapy sessions, and long, sleepless nights in a small apartment where the silence was so deafening it felt like a physical weight. I had to learn how to live again, from the ground up, how to make a decision, any decision, without a voice in my head, second-guessing it, how to trust my own judgment, which had been so systematically dismantled, how to rebuild a sense of self-worth that had been chipped away, day by day, with every subtle criticism and every manipulative twist of reality. The rebuilding process was an archaeological dig for my own soul. I had to sift through the rubble of my past life to find the artifacts of who I was before him. Slowly, carefully, I started unearthing pieces of myself I had buried to fit into his world. I called a friend he had subtly isolated me from, and hearing her voice, warm and unchanged, was like finding water in a desert. I found my old paintbrushes, dusty in a box in the back of the closet. He'd always discouraged my painting, calling it a messy hobby. The first time I put paint to canvas, my hands shook. But as the colors spread, something inside me started to heal. I was creating something that was mine alone. I took a trip by myself, a small weekend trip to the coast. I wasn't running away from anything. For the first time, I was running toward myself. Standing on a cliff, with the wind whipping my hair and the vast ocean in front of me, I discovered a strength I never knew I had, a resilience forged in the fire of his deception. I learned how to set boundaries, how to say the word no and mean it, and how to honor my own truth above anyone else's opinion. Today, the woman speaking to you is not a victim. I am a survivor who has turned her scars into a roadmap. The ashes of my old life weren't an ending. They were the fertile ground from which I was reborn. I found a new purpose, a new sense of peace, not in the arms of someone else, but in the quiet, steady strength within myself. My story, which was once about the glittering facade of a perfect man, is now about the authentic, unshakable strength of a real woman. When I look in the mirror now, I don't see that hollowed-out stranger anymore. I see the battle scars, yes, but they don't look like damage, they look like victory. More than anything, I see the woman who saved herself. And that is a love story no one can ever take away from me. This isn't a story about an ending. It's about the powerful, liberating, and beautiful beginning of the rest of my life. Before you can understand the wreckage, you have to understand the cathedral that was built first. You have to see the stained glass windows and the soaring arches, and you have to feel the sense of sanctuary it promised. Our beginning, it was a masterpiece of construction. We met at a fundraiser for the city library, one of those events where people wear their philanthropy like a well-tailored suit. The air was thick, with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of polite, ambitious conversation. I was there with a friend, feeling a little out of my depth, a little too ordinary for the polished marble floors and the champagne that flowed like water. I was standing near a towering bookshelf, tracing the spine of an old copy of The Great Gatsby, when a voice next to me, smooth as velvet, said, "Careful. That much hope can be a dangerous thing." I turned, and there he was. It's almost a cliché to say the rest of the room faded away, but that's the honest truth of it. He had this way of looking at you, a focused, unwavering attention, that made you feel like you were the only story in a library full of books. He wasn't just handsome in a generic, forgettable way. He had a presence, an energy that drew you in. His smile didn't just touch his lips, it lit up his entire face, crinkling the corners of his eyes in a way that felt genuine, warm, and completely disarming. My first impression wasn't just that he was attractive, it was that he was kind. There was a gentleness in his eyes that seemed to cut through all the noise and pretense of the room. He asked me about the book, not as a pickup line, but with a genuine curiosity that made me feel seen. We talked for what felt like hours, tucked away in that quiet corner. He wasn't trying to impress me with his job or his connections. He was trying to understand me. He asked about my passions, my dreams, the things I was afraid to say out loud to anyone else. And I, who had always been so guarded, found myself opening up to this stranger as if I had known him my entire life. What drew me in wasn't a list of qualities. It was a feeling. The feeling of being completely and utterly understood. In those early days, he was the embodiment of everything I thought a good man was supposed to be. He was thoughtful to a degree I had never experienced. He'd remember a throwaway comment I'd made weeks earlier about a type of flower I liked, and then surprise me with a bouquet of them, just because. He was ambitious and driven, but he framed it as wanting to build a secure and beautiful future for us. He was a perfect gentleman, not just with me, but with everyone. He'd hold the door for strangers, treat the waitress with the same respect he'd give a CEO, and talk about his own parents with a reverence that made my heart ache. He presented himself as a man of deep integrity, of unshakable principles. He was my rock, my champion, the man who saw the best version of me, and made me believe it was the only version that existed. There's one memory from that time that I used to hold on to like a precious stone. It was about 3 months after we started dating. We had driven out of the city for the weekend to a small town in the mountains. It was autumn, and the world was on fire with reds and golds. On our last night, a sudden storm rolled in, fierce and loud, knocking out the power in our little rental cabin. We were left with nothing but a fireplace and a handful of candles. I was a little scared of the storm, the way the wind howled and threw rain against the windows, but he wasn't. He built a fire, and we sat on a blanket on the floor, the candlelight flickering across his face. And he started to talk. He told me about his childhood, painting a picture of a boy who had to overcome so much. A boy who learned early on that you had to be strong for everyone else. He spoke of his dreams, not just for his career, but for a life filled with meaning, a life built on love and trust. He looked at me in the firelight, his eyes seeming to hold a universe of vulnerability, and he said, "I feel like I've been searching for you my whole life, not just a partner, but a home, and with you, I feel like I'm finally home." In that moment, under the roar of the storm wrapped in the warmth of the fire, I didn't just fall in love, I surrendered to it. I believed every word. I saw our entire future laid out before us, as clear and as beautiful as the stars that would fill the sky after the storm passed. That night, he gave me the perfect story, the perfect promise. It was the cornerstone of the cathedral he was building, and I walked into it willingly, believing with every fiber of my being that it was a sanctuary built to last forever. That night in the cabin wasn't just a moment. It was the blueprint. It was the foundation upon which he would build everything that followed. After that storm, our love story accelerated, as if he had decided the trial period was over and it was time for the main performance. The transition from dating to marriage felt less like a progression and more like a coronation. He wasn't just my boyfriend anymore, he was my future, and he made sure everyone knew it. The proposal came 6 months later. It was, of course, a production. He knew I loved old movie theaters, the ones with velvet seats and gilded ceilings. He rented out the entire grand lobby of the historic Orpheum downtown, under the guise of taking me to a classic film screening. When we walked in, the cavernous space was empty except for a single spotlight on a small table in the center. Hundreds of candles flickered along the grand staircase and balconies, their light dancing on the ornate gold leaf. And string quartet, hidden in the shadows, began to play the simple, beautiful melody from my favorite film. He led me to the center of the room, and his hands, which were usually so steady, were trembling just slightly. It was the most human, most vulnerable I had ever seen him. He spoke of our future not in maybes, but in certainties. He didn't just ask me to be his wife. He painted a picture of the life we would build, the children we would raise, the legacy of love we would leave behind. And when he got down on one knee, holding out a ring that caught the candlelight and splintered it into 1,000 tiny stars, the world stopped. Of course I said yes. How could I not? It wasn't just a proposal, it was the climax of a perfect love story, and I was its leading lady. The applause wasn't just from me, it was from our friends and family, who he had secretly invited to watch from the balcony above. They erupted in cheers, and I was swept up in the beautiful, overwhelming, and perfectly staged emotion of it all. Our first years of marriage were a golden age. We were a team, a unit, the golden couple, as our friends jokingly called us. We bought the house on the tree-lined street, the one with the wraparound porch I'd always dreamed of. Our life was a whirlwind of dinner parties, where the wine flowed, and the laughter was easy, weekend trips to wine country, and quiet Sunday mornings spent with the newspaper and coffee in bed. We were building a life, brick by brick, and every brick was laid with what I believed was mutual love and shared ambition. Our dreams were woven together so tightly, it was impossible to see where his ended and mine began. He was climbing the ladder at his firm, and his success was our success. I was his sounding board, his strategist, the one who hosted the partners for dinner and remembered all their wives' names. My role, as I saw it, was to create the perfect sanctuary for him to return to, a life so beautiful and seamless that he could go out and conquer the world. We planned for a future with 2 children, a boy and a girl, and a golden retriever. We talked about the trips we would take to Europe, the charities we would support, the kind of old couple we would become, the ones who still held hands walking through the park. It was a beautiful, compelling vision, and I poured every ounce of my soul into making it a reality. There were so many moments of what felt like pure, unadulterated happiness. But one stands out, a memory so perfect it almost feels like a dream now. It was our 2nd anniversary. He told me he was taking me to a fancy dinner, but instead, he drove us back to that little town in the mountains, back to the very same cabin where he had first told me I felt like home. This time, there was no storm. The sky was clear and filled with a breathtaking canopy of stars. He had filled the cabin with my favorite flowers, and he'd cooked my favorite meal himself, something he never did. After dinner, we sat on that same blanket in front of the fireplace. He gave me his gift. It wasn't jewelry or some expensive trinket. It was a leather-bound book. On the cover, embossed in gold, were the words, "The Architecture of Us." Inside, he had chronicled our entire relationship. He had saved ticket stubs from our first date, pressed a flower from the bouquet he'd given me, and written down dozens of memories, little moments I had almost forgotten. On each page, he wrote about what that moment meant to him, how it was another brick laid in the foundation of our life. The last page was blank, except for a single sentence written in his elegant script. "To the rest of our forever, the best is yet to be built." I sat there, turning the pages, with tears streaming down my face. It was the most thoughtful, most romantic, most deeply personal gift I had ever received. It was proof. It was tangible evidence that he saw our life, our love, the same way I did, as something sacred we were building together. I remember looking at him in the firelight, my heart so full it felt like it might burst. In that moment, he wasn't just my husband, he was my soulmate, the keeper of my memories, the architect of my happiness. I felt completely and utterly safe, cherished, and known. That memory became my North Star, the point I navigated by whenever a small doubt or a tiny crack appeared. It was the high point, the pinnacle of the cathedral. And from that height, I couldn't see how far I would have to fall. You can't pinpoint the exact moment a beautiful day turns to dusk. There's no single second when the light officially gives way to shadow. It's a slow fade, a gradual cooling of the air you barely notice until you find yourself shivering in the dark. That's how the cracks began. They didn't shatter our perfect world overnight. They crept in, fine as a spider's thread, while I was still basking in the glow of our perfect life. After that anniversary, with that beautiful leather-bound book, The Architecture of Us, sitting on our coffee table, I felt invincible. That book was my proof, my constitution. Any time a flicker of doubt crossed my mind, I'd run my hand over the gold lettering and remind myself of the man who had so carefully chronicled our love. The problem is, you can't live inside a memory. And in the present, the architect of my happiness was slowly, meticulously, changing the blueprints. The first tremor I couldn't ignore was over something so small, so laughably insignificant, it shames me to even say it. A dinner reservation. He was late coming home from work one Tuesday, and I called his favorite Italian place to see if they could push our 8 o'clock reservation. The hostess was confused. "Ma'am," she said, her voice tinny over the phone, "we don't have a reservation for you tonight. We have one for your husband for last Tuesday, but he canceled it." A cold knot formed in my stomach. Last Tuesday, he had told me he was working late, eating a sad desk salad. When he finally walked through the door an hour later, smelling faintly of wine and something else, a perfume that wasn't mine, I asked him about it. I tried to keep my voice light, casual. "Hey honey, funny thing. I called La Trattoria, and they said you had a reservation there last week that you canceled. I thought you were at the office." And that's when I saw it for the first time, the shift. It was instantaneous and terrifying. The warm, loving husband vanished. In his place was a stranger, with cold, assessing eyes. He didn't get angry, not at first. He tilted his head, a look of profound, theatrical disappointment on his face. "Wow," he said, his voice soft but laced with steel. "So this is what we're doing now? You're checking up on me?" The conversation was no longer about the lie. It was about my betrayal of his trust. He masterfully twisted it, until I was the one apologizing. I was overstressed. I was being insecure. By the end of the conversation, I was comforting him, reassuring him that I trusted him completely, my heart pounding with shame, forever having doubted him. He held me, stroking my hair, and said, "I just want us to be happy. Don't let your worrying ruin what we have." He made my intuition feel like a character flaw. And I believed him. From that day on, the gaslighting became his primary tool. It was a constant, low-level hum of psychological warfare. My feelings were no longer valid. They were overreactions. My memories were faulty. He'd say things like, "I never said that. You have a habit of twisting my words, you know that?" Or, "You're so emotional. You need to learn to think more logically, like I do." He began to use my love for him as a weapon. If I questioned him, I wasn't being a supportive wife. If I wanted a night out with my own friends, I was being selfish and neglecting our relationship. He isolated me, not with locks and chains but with guilt and carefully worded concerns. My best friend, Sarah? She's a bad influence, honey. She's so negative. I just worry she brings you down. My painting? It takes up so much of your time, and the smell of the turpentine gives me a headache. Don't you think you'd be happier finding a hobby we could do together? I started to feel like a ghost in my own life. I was shrinking, making myself smaller and smaller to avoid upsetting him. To avoid another one of those conversations where I ended up feeling confused and crazy. The perfect life we had built began to feel like a stage set, and I was forgetting my lines. The crack that finally fractured the foundation was about money. He always handled our finances. He said he enjoyed it, that it was his way of taking care of me, and I, the trusting wife, was happy to let him. One afternoon I was looking for a postage stamp in his desk drawer and I found it. A folded bank statement from a bank I didn't recognize. It was a business account, but the withdrawals were anything but. Thousands of dollars spent at high-end jewelry stores in cities he had never mentioned visiting. A recurring monthly payment to a property management company for an address I had never seen. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. This wasn't a misremembered dinner. This was black and white. This was real. That night I waited for him in the living room, the statement on the coffee table between us like a bomb. I didn't yell. My voice was quiet, trembling. What is this? His reaction was a masterclass in manipulation. First came the flash of pure, cold fury in his eyes, the rage of a king whose authority has been questioned. But it was gone in a second, replaced by a mask of deep, sorrowful injury. He sank onto the sofa, put his head in his hands, and let out a long, weary sigh. I can't believe you went through my desk, he began, his voice thick with pain. After everything we've built, this is the trust you have in me? He explained it all away with a story so intricate, so plausible, I almost fell for it. The account was a surprise for me. A secret investment to build a nest egg so we could buy a vacation home, the one I'd always dreamed of in North Carolina. The jewelry was an investment too, something he was buying and holding for a client. The apartment was a temporary corporate lease for a new hire at his firm. Every lie was wrapped in a kernel of our shared dreams, making it impossible to unravel without feeling like I was destroying our future. He ended his performance by turning the tables completely. You know, he said, looking at me with those sad, wounded eyes, I work so hard for us. For this life. And it just hurts me, right here, he touched his chest, to think you see me as some kind of villain, that you think I would ever betray you. And there it was. I was the villain. I was the ungrateful wife who snooped. I was the one destroying our happiness with my paranoia. I broke down. I cried and I apologized. And he held me, just like before, telling me it was okay, that he forgave me. Lying there in his arms that night, I felt a profound sense of self-loathing. But beneath it, for the first time, a tiny, cold ember of certainty began to glow. He was lying. I knew it in my bones. And in that moment, our beautiful home, our cathedral of love, stopped feeling like a sanctuary. It started to feel like a tomb. I was married to a man I was beginning to realize I didn't know at all. And the scariest part was, I was utterly and completely alone with him inside it. The ember of certainty that had started to glow in the dark wasn't extinguished by his performance of forgiveness. It was banked, hidden, waiting for oxygen. It didn't need another grand betrayal to ignite it. It just needed one clear, undeniable moment that showed me the absolute emptiness behind his eyes. And that moment came a few weeks later, on a gray Wednesday afternoon. I got a call from my doctor. A routine test had come back with an irregularity. They needed me to come in for more tests, for a biopsy. The word itself, biopsy, landed in my stomach like a stone. It might be nothing, the nurse said, but my mind immediately went to the darkest possible places. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking, my world tilting on its axis. All I wanted in that moment was my husband. I needed my rock. He came home that evening, humming, dropping his briefcase by the door. I waited until he had poured himself a drink and settled into his favorite chair. I took a deep breath, my voice unsteady, and I told him. I told him about the doctor's call, about the tests, about the word biopsy. I told him I was scared. I watched his face, searching for the man I had married, for the man who had held me through a thunderstorm and promised me a forever, and he wasn't there. There was no flicker of concern, no softening of his eyes. Instead, a shadow of annoyance crossed his face. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, swirled the ice in his glass, and said, "Well, try not to get worked up about it. The last thing I need right now is for you to get all hysterical. I have that big presentation on Friday, and your stress is just going to throw me off my game." And that was it. That was the oxygen the ember had been waiting for. In that one brutally selfish sentence, I saw everything with a terrifying clarity. My fear was an inconvenience. My potential illness was a distraction from his life. I was not a person to him. I was a supporting character, and I was going off script. The man I loved didn't exist. The man I was married to was a monster, made not of flesh and blood, but of an insatiable, hollow ego. I looked at the stranger sitting in my living room, and the fear I had been living with for months was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, final resolve. It was no longer a question of if I would leave. It was a question of how I would survive it. There was no conversation where the word divorce was spoken between us. I knew, with absolute certainty, that a conversation would be a trap. It would be another stage for him to perform on, another chance to twist my words, to manipulate my emotions, to break me down until I apologized for wanting to save my own life. So I didn't give him that stage. The first time he saw the word divorce was in an email from my lawyer, sent one day after I had vanished from his life. His reaction was exactly what I had predicted. It was not the grief of a heartbroken husband. It was the incandescent rage of a dethroned king. He called me, again and again, his number flashing on my cheap burner phone. I finally answered, my heart hammering against my ribs, knowing I had to face it once. His voice was not pleading. It was a low, menacing snarl. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed. "You're throwing away everything I've given you. You will have nothing. You are nothing without me. I built you, and I will tear you down to the ground." In that moment, he gave me the greatest gift he had ever given me, the complete and utter confirmation that I had done the right thing. I listened to his threats, and for the first time, I didn't hear a powerful man. I heard a desperate child throwing a tantrum because his favorite toy had just grown legs and walked away. I said nothing. I just listened until he was done, and then I hung up. I threw the phone away and never looked back. The weeks that followed were a disorienting blend of terror and liberation. I was living in a small, furnished apartment across town, a place with no memories and thin walls. The silence was overwhelming. So was the fallout. He immediately launched a smear campaign, playing the part of the devastated, bewildered husband to perfection. He told our friends that I had suffered a mental breakdown, that I had become unstable and paranoid. Some of them believed him. I lost friends, people I had celebrated holidays with, people whose children I had held as babies. Their pitying looks and whispered concerns hurt more than his anger ever could. They saw the mask he wore, the charming Mr. Perfect, and they couldn't imagine the emptiness behind it. I was utterly alone, adrift in the wreckage of my own life. The divorce process was not a separation. It was a war. He fought me on everything, not because he wanted the assets, but because he wanted to punish me. He used the legal system as his new weapon of choice. Our savings, which I had believed were for our future, were hidden in a labyrinth of accounts I never knew existed. The house, our home, became a battleground. He was determined to leave me with nothing, to prove his final terrifying threat that I would be nothing without him. The lowest point came during the deposition. We sat across from each other at a long, polished table in a soulless conference room. I hadn't seen him in months. He looked exactly the same, impeccably dressed, calm, confident. I, on the other hand, felt like a raw, exposed nerve. His lawyer, a woman with eyes as cold as his, questioned me for hours. She twisted my memories, painted me as a vindictive, hysterical, and ungrateful wife. She used my own words, my own pain, against me. And through it all, he just sat there, watching me, with a small, unreadable smile on his face. It was the most brutal, calculated act of psychological torture I have ever endured. I wanted to crumble. I wanted to run out of the room screaming. But I didn't. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and I saw not a powerful man, but a pathetic one. And I held on. The day I signed the final divorce papers, it was raining. A cold, steady November drizzle. I sat in my lawyer's office, the thick stack of papers on the desk between us. My hand was shaking as I picked up the pen. This was it. The legal end to a life that had ended emotionally a lifetime ago. With each signature, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a wave of profound sadness, not for the man he was, but for the man I had thought he was, for the beautiful dream he had sold me. I was grieving the death of a ghost, but underneath the grief, something else was rising. It was a quiet, powerful, and unfamiliar feeling. It was relief. When I signed the last page, I pushed the papers back across the desk and looked out the window at the rain-streaked city. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't a failure. It was an emancipation. I had walked into that marriage a hopeful girl, and I was walking out a battle-scarred woman. The world outside that window was terrifying and unknown. I had almost nothing to my name. But for the first time in over a decade, I had myself. I had my freedom. And I was finally ready to see what I could build with it. After the final signature, the rain outside felt like the world was weeping with me, and for me. But then, the storm passed. And what was left was a quiet, so absolute, it was a sound in itself. My first few months of freedom were spent learning the language of that quiet. In the house I had shared with him, every silence had been charged with tension, a prelude to his mood, his needs, his next performance. But in my tiny, one-bedroom apartment, the silence was mine. At first, it was terrifying. It was the sound of loneliness, the echo of everything I had lost. I would lie awake at night, and the silence would amplify my fears. What have you done? You've thrown everything away. You're alone. But slowly, something shifted. I started to fill that silence, not with noise, but with myself. I started with the smallest things. I bought a coffee maker and made my coffee exactly how I liked it. A little too strong, something he'd always commented on. I bought brightly colored throw pillows because they made me happy, even though they didn't match anything. These weren't just decisions, they were declarations of independence. For the first time in over a decade, my home was a reflection of me, not of us. And in that quiet, I began to hear a voice I hadn't heard in years. My own. Healing wasn't a straight line. It was a messy, circular, and often exhausting process. My therapist called it an archaeological dig, and she was right. I was digging through layers of sedimented grief and confusion to find the person I was before she was buried. I reconnected with my friend Sarah, the one he had so skillfully pushed away. I was terrified to make the call, expecting an "I told you so." Instead, all I heard on the other end of the line was, "I've missed you so much. I'm so glad you're back." We met for coffee, and I cried for an hour, and she just listened, holding my hand, and in her eyes, I saw not pity, but the reflection of the strong woman she had always known me to be. And then, I found my way back to my art. I bought a cheap easel and a set of paints. The first time I stood in front of that blank canvas, I was paralyzed. The smell of the turpentine, the smell he'd called a headache, filled my small apartment, and it smelled like rebellion. I put on the music he hated, loud and unapologetic, and I just started. I didn't paint anything specific. I painted my anger, my grief, my confusion. I threw colors on that canvas until my hands were stained and my shoulders ached, and when I was done, I wasn't just looking at a painting. I was looking at my soul, finally allowed to be messy and complicated and real. Today, my life looks nothing like it did before, and I thank God for that every day. I live in a small apartment in a part of the city with a little more grit and a lot more character. My routine is simple. I wake up with the sun, I make my 2-strong coffee, and I spend an hour in my little makeshift studio before I head to work. I left the world of corporate fundraising behind, and now I teach art to kids at a local community center. It doesn't pay nearly as much, but for the first time, my work fills my spirit instead of just my bank account. The sound of children's laughter and the sight of their uninhibited creativity is a daily reminder of the joy of authenticity. The woman I am now is fundamentally different. I'm quieter, but I'm not silent. I'm more discerning with my trust, but I'm not cynical. I've learned that my sensitivity, the very thing he used as a weapon against me, is actually my greatest strength. It's my intuition, it's my empathy, it's the compass that was trying to guide me all along, and I've finally learned to listen to it. I learned that real love doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't build a cage, no matter how gilded, it gives you the sky. Have I forgiven him? That's a complicated question. I don't think I'll ever forgive the deliberate cruelty, the calculated destruction of my spirit. But I have forgiven the situation. I have released myself from the prison of what if and if only. Forgiveness for me wasn't about absolving him. It was about taking the knife he'd left in my back, pulling it out, and letting the wound finally heal. It was about refusing to let his poison run through my veins for one more day. As for the future, it's a blank canvas. And for the first time in my life, that doesn't scare me. It excites me. Am I open to love again? Yes, I think so. But my definition of love has changed. It's no longer about finding my other half, because I am already whole. It will be about finding someone who celebrates that wholeness, someone whose quiet matches my quiet. But I'm not waiting for that. My life is full right now. It's full of friendships that are real, work that has meaning, and a profound sense of peace that I earned with my own two hands. I built a life out of the rubble he left behind. Not a perfect life, not a life for a Pinterest board, but something so much better, a real one. And it's all mine. If I could reach back through time, back through all the pain and the fire, and speak to that woman standing in the grand lobby of the Orpheum, blinded by candlelight and a perfect dream, what would I say to her? First, I would wrap my arms around her. I would hold her tight and tell her, none of this is your fault. Your only crime was to love with an open and hopeful heart, and that is never a crime. It is a gift. I would tell her, that little knot in your stomach, that quiet whisper in the back of your mind that you keep pushing down, the one that tells you something is not right, that is not paranoia. It is not insecurity. It is your soul's compass. It is your truth. And I need you to start listening to it. Listen to it more than you listen to his beautiful words. Trust the feeling in your bones more than you trust the promises he writes in a leather-bound book. I would tell her that the things he calls your flaws, your sensitivity, your emotional depth, are actually your superpowers. They are what make you human, what allow you to connect, what will ultimately be your salvation. Do not let anyone, especially not the person who claims to love you, convince you that your greatest strengths are your weaknesses. And I would tell her this, love should not feel like a cage, no matter how beautiful its bars are. It should not require you to shrink, to quiet your voice, or to edit your soul. Real love feels like coming home to yourself, not losing yourself in someone else. You are so much stronger than you know. You will walk through hell, but you will come out the other side, not burned but forged. And if you are listening to this right now, and my story echoes in the silent rooms of your own life, I see you. I know the terror of walking on eggshells on what is supposed to be your own sacred ground. I know the dizzying confusion of being told that what you just saw you didn't see, that what you just felt you didn't feel. Please hear me when I say this. You are not crazy. Your reality is real. That feeling in your gut is your truth fighting to be heard. Listen to it. The journey out is the most terrifying one you will ever take. The fear of the unknown can feel greater than the pain of the known. But I am here to tell you, from the other side, that freedom is real. And it is worth every single terrifying step. Courage is not a sudden roar of defiance. Sometimes, it's the quiet voice at the end of the day that says, I will try again tomorrow. Sometimes, it's packing a single bag. Sometimes, it's just making one phone call to a friend you haven't spoken to in years. Your life is not over. The wreckage you see around you is not your tomb. It is the construction site for your new life. And this time, you are the architect. You get to choose the materials. You get to design the rooms. You get to decide where the windows go so you can let in as much light as you want. The story he wrote for you was a fiction. But your story, the real one, is just beginning. The end of his lie is the beginning of your truth. And the greatest, most enduring, most powerful love story you will ever write is the one where you, finally, come home to yourself. It's waiting for you. Go live it.